Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us at this month's First Thursday Club. So we are delighted to join you live from COP26 today, although strictly speaking, Steph, who I will introduce in a moment, is lurking in a hotel room in Glasgow somewhere where it is quiet enough to actually do this webinar. So I'm Gavin Wilson, I'm a director in RSK Biosensors, and I'm standing in today for Tim Hounsome, who can't be with us, to host the webinar and manage your questions. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones will be automatically muted during the webinar. However, if you have any questions and would encourage you to ask, please enter them in the Q&A box online and we'll answer as many of them as we can at the end of the webinar. And any that we don't have time to answer, we'll try to follow up with you afterwards. So about an hour or so after we finish, we'll send you a short survey. Please spare us a few minutes if you can to give us a little bit of feedback to help us refine and shape the future of these webinars. We'd very much appreciate it. So our speaker today is probably a familiar face to many of you. Stephanie Ray is a director of RSK Biosensors and the founder of the First Thursday Club. This year, however, she's moved away from mainstream ecology consultancy to start Nature Positive, a management consultancy that helps organisations to be more sustainable. And today she's taken time out from activities at COP26 to talk to us about net zero. Are we all just missing the point? So over to you, Steph.
Thanks, Gav. Right, I'm just going to turn my webcam off, hopefully, and you can still see me. Or no, there you go. You can see my slides, hopefully. Right, thanks very much. Well, I'm often told, usually by well-meaning sustainability consultants, that carbon is the currency of sustainable development. I disagree, or at least if it is, then it's only one particular form of carbon and it's not pencils. Money is the currency of sustainability, and carbon sometimes gets used as a proxy for money, and that's for three real reasons. One, it's very easy to measure carbon. You can come up with a number for your carbon footprint, and so you can focus on that and you can try to reduce it. Two, it's tradable, so you can balance your losses and gains in a reasonable kind of exchange system. And three, therefore, you can put a price on it, you can convert it to money, economists can understand it, and businesses can work with it. But carbon isn't equivalent to sustainability. Becoming carbon neutral isn't the same as delivering sustainable development. And in many ways, climate change is a symptom of our unsustainable use of planetary resources rather than the issue itself. So I would assert that it's perfectly possible for your business, your organisation, your household to reach net zero and yet completely miss the point. And yet net zero is taking so much corporate attention, time, political will, and consultancy effort. We're all focusing so intently on net zero that we're at risk of actually ignoring our, in this picture, frankly, adorable biodiversity impacts. So I know what you're going to say, it's that ecology woman going on again. Why pick biodiversity? That's just a different silo to focus on. Let's remember what biodiversity actually means. It's all of the variety of life on Earth, everything that's alive, and it underpins all of those provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural services that we all rely on for everything. One of those services is climate regulation. So we're all focused intently on one single ecosystem service because it happens to be easy to measure, while all the rest of our planetary impacts are pleading for your attention. I'm starting to realize that I'm the hairy dog in this analogy, but I'm going with it anyway. And so here I am, the hairy dog, saying, hang on a minute, biodiversity. It's not just another silo. It's not just a special interest that's cared about by bunny huggers like me. It underpins everything. It's life on Earth. So let's unpack a few of the net zero myths and see why we should be all aiming instead the nature positive. So here's net zero myth number 1. I have reached net zero, or more usually, I will reach net zero by X date. And then in the tiny print, for my scope 1 emissions. Well done. Your scope 1 emissions, your direct emissions, will be a fraction of the total emissions of your value chain. And for many companies, the majority of their emissions actually live upstream in their value chain or in their raw materials. I've got an example here. This comes from Hitachi, where your scope 1 emissions are less than 1% of their total carbon footprint, and most of their emissions actually in this case are downstream. They relate to the use and disposal of their products. And I should point out that I'm not criticising Hitachi here. They're not making big claims based on their scope 1 emissions. They're making a very clear point about where their issues actually lie. And whilst it might not be as extreme as this particular example, that's relevant to most of us. Even where companies are including their scope 3 emissions in their transition plans, how they're doing it can also be quite sketchy. So a claim of, I'm going to reach net zero by 2030 might run something like, year 1, start turning all the lights off. Year 2, switch to renewable energy. Year 5, electrify the fleet. Year 7, some sort of new miraculous technology that we don't understand yet is invented. Year 10, net zero. And so that's our first net zero myth, if you like. Actually getting there, how plausible is it, and what parts of our actual emissions are we taking into account in our claims? So we need to treat net zero claims with a dose of healthy skepticism. Net zero myth number 2, offsetting. Now there's a can of worms. I've got nothing against offsetting in principle, and some carbon offsets are fantastic, particularly when it's the right offset in the right place, particularly when we're restoring ecosystems through nature-based solutions like peat rewetting, like seagrass beds and kelp beds. They're fantastic. But where offsetting is easy and a cheap option, it can disincentivize following the mitigation hierarchy and actually making sure that organisations have gone as far as they possibly can in reducing their emissions before we get to the stage of offsetting. Now, there is a shortage of good quality offsets. They're certainly geographically restricted. There's a huge unmet demand for UK-based offsets that can actually be delivered. So we're not always able to pay back to the communities that we've impacted through our offsetting activities. And even where companies have the best of intentions, offsetting has become a challenging term, and there's always a risk of accusations of greenwashing. Lots of organisations are doing quite nicely, actually, from the arbitrage between the cost of carbon where they emit it and the cost of carbon where they offset it. And there's no incentive for them. They're not necessarily paying a realistic cost of carbon or using internally within their own organisations a realistic cost of carbon for their internal decision making. And then, of course, there's the issue of the deliverability of all this offsetting we're all going to do. Oxfam's recent report identified that the total land required for planned carbon removal to achieve the Paris targets would be equivalent to 5 times the area of India, or to put it another way, all of the farmland on the planet. So clearly that's not possible. So we're all relying on this mystery technology that we don't yet understand. If you have a science-based target, like we do at RSK, you'll be restricted in the amount of offsetting you can do to get to net zero. But it's just important to be aware that this offsetting is a bit of a minefield. Zero emissions is a very different proposition to net zero. So changing tack slightly then, our net zero myth number 3 is an attitudinal one. Particularly when facing up to the realities of scope 3, organisations start to go, but it's all just too hard. The change is just too big. And so this is a story that was told to me by another consultant, Simon Alsbury. And those of you in the audience who are of a younger demographic than me may readily recognise this particular drink, the Porn Star Martini. It's a sickly sweet blend of vodka, passion fruit liqueur, sugar syrup and lime juice, served with a shot of Prosecco and half a passion fruit floating in it. So far, so Friday night. However, Simon's client in the beverage trade pointed out to him that most of his clientele didn't actually eat the passion fruit. So it was just thrown away at the end of the evening. So I got to thinking, like you do, what would be the carbon saving if we just, well, didn't chuck half an unwanted fruit into a drink? And I did what I highly recommend anyone does when you want a very random thing estimated. I asked a couple of economics students. If anyone's interested, they can also tell you how many rolls of wrapping paper it would take to wrap Tower Bridge if you're particularly keen. So anyway, the figure they came up with was 6 million pornstar martinis were sold in bars in the UK every year. We're not interested if you're drinking it out of a can from Marks and Spencer's, unless you're doing it on the tube, because apparently that's illegal. So let's say that 80% of people actually do leave the fruit at the end. So that's 5 million drinks, or 2.5 million passion fruit. 2.5 million passion fruit we estimated was around 125 tons of fruit. So we worked out the carbon cost of growing, shipping, handling and transporting 125 tons of passion fruit, bringing them over from Brazil. Turns out passion fruit are a reasonably sustainable fruit if you do want to eat them. They don't take a huge amount of water to grow. They tend to be shipped rather than air freighted. And yet still, the passion fruit that we put into drinks comes to 177 tons of carbon dioxide. So we could save 177 tons of carbon, which I roughly calculate is enough to fly from London to Sydney and back 50 times every year by the simple measure of not floating a wrinkly fruit in your drink for 30 minutes before you throw it away. My point, I think there was one, is yes, the climate crisis is big and the climate crisis is scary, but there are still significant reductions to be made in our societal carbon footprint by not doing stupid things. And food waste is clearly one of the stupidest. Which brings us on to net zero 4. It's kind of related. Not only is it big, it's complicated. Trying to understand what your impacts are on the planet beyond climate change is big. It's trying to detect and triangulate the vectors of interconnectedness of all things. And of course, I'm an ecologist, we're ecologists, that's what we all do. So whilst organisations might need to think about their wider impacts, it's a bit hard. So the excuse is, well, I'm just going to focus on carbon for a bit longer because that's the biggest priority, right? Well, not necessarily. Until you actually look at your impact on nature and your dependence on ecosystem services, you don't really know what your biggest priority is. Now, that doesn't need to be a forensic examination of your value chain straight away. You can start with a fairly simple hotspot analysis. You've probably done one to check for labour issues or modern slavery, so look again with a different focus. It is complicated, but it's really not that scary. Myth number 5, we can't deal with whatever it is, getting to net zero, looking at our full planetary impacts, because it would make us uncompetitive, what I call the customer won't pay excuse. Well, here's the thing. Most customers, especially the younger generation, who of course in future will be all your customers, say they would pay for more sustainable products. What a puzzler. Then of course we set the prices and we edit customer choice. If we present two products and say, do you want this one or this one? They're both the same, but this one's more expensive. They're going to choose the cheap one. If we say, do you want this one? It's cheap, but that cheapness has come at an indescribable cost of the wellness of future generations. Or would you like this sustainable one that's 5p more? Most people tend to go for the 5 pence more. And then, of course, when we get down to it, we find that quite often the sustainable option isn't any more expensive. Sustainability is often about doing more with less. It's about avoiding waste and using all of the resources that we use efficiently. Now, an engineering team that used to work for me once had to design a new station in London, and we had an outline design from the client, and we decided to propose for our detailed design a much more sustainable version, made better use of materials, better use of natural light and heating, and was altogether a superior design. It was also £10 million cheaper. So it is possible it's perfectly possible to do things, to just rethink how we're doing things, and nobody has to necessarily pay for the sustainability premium. Net zero myth number 6. This one runs along the lines of, I've heard what you're saying, the climate and biodiversity crises are linked, I get it, nature-based solutions, gotcha. So if I just carry on dealing with my climate impacts, then I'll automatically be dealing with biodiversity, won't I? Well, no, not necessarily. Let's assume that I'm a furniture manufacturer and that I import a lot of timber from Indonesia to make my lovely hardwood furniture. I want to do some offsetting, and I decided it would be lovely to do some insetting. I'm going to do some habitat creation and plant some trees around my factory in Scotland. Well, have I balanced my impacts? Have I delivered for biodiversity? Well, I might, depending on what I plant and where I plant it, have some benefits for biodiversity. If I plant it on a bog, I'm probably having negative effects on biodiversity. But what I'm not doing is replacing all of those ecosystem services that the trees that I took down in Indonesia had there, for local biodiversity, for water management, for climate regulation, for the amenity of local people. I've taken those away and I haven't replaced them. Some of those ecosystem services might have been very important locally, possibly more important than the carbon impact that I'm trying to offset. So again, we need to think about which are the wider impacts we need to tackle, how important they are, how dependent we are on them, and make sure that we're actually answering the right questions with our climate proposals. And then finally, my net zero myth number 7, you've talked about wider impacts and looking at all of my planetary impacts. Well, here I am, I'm using the SDGs, so I must be sustainable. The problem is that many people apply the SDGs like there's some kind of a la carte menu that they can pick and choose from. So I'm going to focus on goal 13. I'm going to throw in a little bit of goal 6 because I'm looking at water. I'm going to do some quality education and some gender equality, and then I'm fine. I'm dealing with the SDGs, aren't I? Well, they don't really work like that. The SDGs are not designed to be used individually. They're designed to be taken together as a set of principles, an aspirational route map, if you like, towards living sustainably and with resilience. So you need to look, again, it's all about interconnectedness and complexity. So we've developed a tool called the SDG IQ to help you take a slightly more intelligent look at your operations using the SDGs and making sure that you're using them fairly and not picking and choosing and risking accusations of greenwash about what it is you'll tackle. Now, the tool is based on this kind of rather attractive wedding cake model of the SDGs. So rather than seeing them as a rectangle of equal boxes, we look at this as how they're actually built up. So we start at the bottom with the biosphere goals, that's 6, 13, 14 and 15, which relate to climate, water and biodiversity. And once you've built that stable base and you're respecting planetary boundaries, then we can start to build in the society goals, and on top of those, the economic goals, with the partnership for the goals as being the cherry on top of the cake, if you like. So here's the tool. This is how it works. So you enter into the tool here. It explains a little bit about what the SDGs are and how you can use this assessment, how it's based on the biosphere goals, and the biosphere goals are weighted within the tool. So you can't get to a maximum score for any of the other goals unless your biosphere goals are in order. And you can log into this, you can run through all of the questions. You can probably get a quick and dirty assessment in about half an hour or so. So it doesn't take a lot of time to just get a really visual feel for how you're doing and what areas you need to concentrate on. So here's the question. So you go through each goal in turn, and it will give you a series of questions. So here in the life below water section, it will be asking you about marine pollution, plastics, restoring coastal ecosystems, fishing if you've got a supply chain that involves fish products and so on. And then you'll answer various questions based on your whole value chain around your direct impacts, what your supply chain's doing, and what happens to your products at the end of their life, what your customers do with them and so on. and then you'll get a report like this. So the reports will tell you how you're performing overall, and it'll give you a picture for your direct operations, your upstream operations, and your downstream operations, and then it will combine all of those to give you an overall map. Now, what we have here is a simple red, amber, green process. It's sort of, and a red effectively says you're really not dealing with this issue yet, or you don't really understand it yet. An amber result says you're making some progress. You haven't necessarily got all of the way, but you're making measurable progress. You don't get to amber for having a plan or a nice policy statement on the wall, just if you're doing something. And green is, yeah, you're all over this. You've got it. Now, one of the things you'll notice if you look particularly at the upstream and downstream reports here is that if you look at the outer ring, the red, amber, green scores in that outer ring relate to the individual questions, or which relate to the individual indicators within the SDG goals. And if you score red for one question, then it will automatically highlight the whole of that goal as red. And a lot of people have said to us, but oh, isn't that fair? Shouldn't you get a sort of average score for your goal? But really, that's not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to highlight where you really need to do some more work. And of course, that goal is only as good as your worst performance. So I might be doing lots of lovely coastal restoration. I might have no impacts on fishing, but I might still have an issue with marine plastics, and therefore I'm red on one of the questions for life underwater. So I'll be red for life underwater, and I'll be red for biosphere goals, and that will flag it up all the way through to our overall score. So we'll see that we've got significant issues that we still need to assess. Now, overall, the tool will give you an IQ score, and that's not immediately it's not immediately to worry you about how close to 100% you are, or because it will be very difficult to get to 100%. All projects have compromises, all organizations have compromises, but what it does is gives you something to work at, and you can see how which tasks you can tackle, if you like, to make your operations more sustainable will increase that score more and move you further on towards being the most sustainable organization you can be. So I wanted to sum up, really, having spent 20 minutes really saying that we need to not focus on net zero. Well, what do we need to focus on? And I'd say there were three of those things. Ooh, going the wrong way. So the first one is obviously biodiversity. It's all about biodiversity. When you're grasping at the mirage of economic output, remember to keep one paw hanging onto your support system, which is nature. If you understand where you rely on things that come from nature, you will understand your impacts, and you'll be able to drive behaviours that make you more sustainable. Second thing, impacts don't end at the factory gate. You share responsibility for your raw materials with your supply chain. You share responsibility for the impacts of your products in their use and disposal with your customers. Because if you don't own those responsibilities, who do you think you're passing them on to? If you track back far enough, to a subsistence farmer, to a developing country that takes your waste, or just to the planet generally and your own children and grandchildren. Ultimately, we all need to own our value chains. And then finally, I guess it could be perceived as what I'm saying is a lot of big, scary things and a lot of emphasis on businesses to change. But with that responsibility comes a massive opportunity to do what businesses do best. Businesses are innovative, they are entrepreneurial. And with the responsibility here, we get the opportunity to innovate, to rethink, to recreate, and, oh, forgive me for using the phrase, to build back better. Now, the demographic earlier in the call who did recognise what a porn star martini was probably don't necessarily remember Blockbuster video shops. and those of my age probably do. But Blockbuster was a massive deal in its day, where you would go along and you borrow a video from them, a VHS video, and then you would pay £3 or something, and you would take it back a couple of days later, and you would inevitably forget to take it back on time, and they'd fine you, and so on. And Netflix started up in opposition as a mail order Blockbuster video. Effectively, they would mail you a DVD, which is pretty sweet, and they didn't have late fees. They didn't believe in them. You just borrowed one, you sent it back when you sent it back, and you couldn't borrow another one until you sent it back. And Blockbuster laughed at them. They thought it was a joke, and it wasn't ever going to catch on, and that they didn't need to be worried about them as a competitor. And indeed, they turned down the opportunity to buy Netflix at one point. And of course, we all know the rest is history. Netflix went into content development and streaming, and now is a massive corporation. And when was the last time you saw a boarded up Blockbuster video shop? So we're talking transformation. We're talking the opportunities brought about by the crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. Give us the opportunity to rethink business, to rethink how we do things, to creatively destroy and build back up. And that's a huge opportunity. And we all get to choose, essentially, whether we want to be a Netflix or a Blockbuster video. So I'm happy to take any questions at that point. I'm going to put my camera back on. I think Gav might reappear, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you've got. In fact, I might make Gav answer them all, because I've done a lot of talking.
No, don't do that. Thanks very much, Steph, for an extremely thought-provoking talk. We've got a bit of time. We've got 15 minutes in this slot still, so there's opportunity to ask. We've got a couple of questions coming through, so I'll dive into these now. So, question from Louise: what would you recommend as a good first step for a company wanting to understand their impacts and their dependencies on nature?
Okay. A good first step is to draw a map, to get a big bit of paper, or you could probably do this in a much more technological approach than me. Get a big bit of paper and draw a map of what are the main inputs and outputs to your business, and then just brainstorm, thought shower, I don't know what word I'm meant to use anymore. What are the potential issues around each of those areas? So, it's like I was saying about supply chains. You don't go straight in and go, I'm going to work back from everyone who's ever sent me an invoice and look into what they're doing. You start with, well, what are the big ticket items going to be? What is my business? I make wind turbines. So I need to look at, where those turbines are made, what materials are the turbine blades made out of, what's involved in the dynamos, what are the rare earth metals that are mined in China that I might want to think about. And so you just build back like that and draw a picture of what your business looks like. And then it's quite easy to find where the hotspots will be and hone in on those.
Okay, thank you very much. So there's another question here from Cara, it's related to that, I suppose. It says, should organisations use a calculator to give a baseline on CO2 emissions and biodiversity to map the progress to zero negative impact?
Yes, I think that would be a great thing to do. I think that we heard a lot yesterday at COP about this move for net zero reporting for corporations and the alliance to find a common framework to do that, which is going to build on things that already exist, like TCFD. It would be a huge opportunity if we were to pull those together now to bring TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, bring that nature reporting, that biodiversity reporting into the same process, and get corporations reporting on all of their natural capital impacts.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question here from Thomas who asks, is the SDG IQ already operational, or is it still a beta testing situation? Because he would like to get stuck into it.
I'm glad you asked that. It's launched in beta. It is available now. If you go to the Nature Positive website, you can register your details there and someone will be in touch to give you access. So it's free to use, to have a play about with. We know it works, it has its basic functionality, but what we want to get feedback on really is, you know, how does it apply to your business? Is it easy enough to understand the questions and how they apply to you? Would you like more explanation around them, and so on?
There we are. Great. I've got a question. So you've talked in detail about net zero. In the broadest terms, how do you define nature positive?
Yeah, nature positive is essentially, it would kind of sit alongside net zero as a kind of twin goal for organisations. We talk about the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And nature positive is really that goal that sits alongside net zero, as what is the point where we bend the curve, where we stop depleting nature and start enhancing it. So let's get to the point where we're actually giving back to the planet rather than taking away. And that can take many forms. It has to follow the same sort of hierarchy that you would have with reducing a carbon footprint. So we're trying to avoid emissions, reduce emissions first, and then looking at what's the offset, if you like, what's the enhancement, what can we give back to nature.
Okay, great, thank you very much. So yeah, related to that again, I suppose there's massive focus this week, obviously, on COP26 on emissions and climate change. I mean, do you think that, I mean, you mentioned it a lot in the talk, that sort of crucial link between climate change and biodiversity is gaining the traction that it needs to have, and quickly enough?
I don't think it's quick enough. I think there's a strong attitude around that, you know, oh, we've only just got our heads around carbon. You've got to let us just focus on this thing first. And, you know, as I explained in the talk, carbon and climate change is a symptom. It's not a primary thing that we should be dealing with. What we should be dealing with is how we use resources sustainably. And if you're using resources within planetary limits, then you'll be resolving the climate crisis. So you can work it that way around, you know, work on nature and climate will sort itself out, but you can't work on climate and expect nature to sort itself out. The equation doesn't work in that direction.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. There's one last question here, which is about, can we send the link to the SDG IQ tool trial to attendees? And I presume that we can.
We can certainly send you a link to the page on the website where you can sign up for it. Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, that's great. That is the last question. We've got a little bit of time in hand. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much again indeed, Steph, for that, and taking time out of COP26 to present this. And thank everybody who has joined us online for attending. I think the next First Thursday Club is on the 2nd of December. I can't believe we're approaching December, but there we are. And just to say goodbye and to wish everyone a good day.
Thanks very much.